I don't know. Wow, that's great. It's a lot better. You guys can be seated. Thank you so much. Hey, I don't know if you have a spouse or a significant other or a mother or a father or a grandfather or someone who, when they call, you can tell by the sound of their voice something is not right. Mine is my wife, and I was standing in front of some wood that I was attempting to chop badly with an axe that I ended up breaking on Friday, camping with some kids, some fathers and kids were down south in the church. We were camping down on some property, and my wife called, and I answered, and she said, "Hey," and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "There is raw sewage floating and flowing out the front of the building." And I was like, okay. And it wasn't just a stream, it was for about 5 hours, and that kicked off a process of a lot of insurance conversations and things that we'll get into much later as a group together and down the line. But for me, in that moment, I don't know how you feel when you get interrupted, but honestly, my first thought was, I'm just trying to camp with my kid. How don't you feel that way? Like, disconnected, gone, out of town. I also don't know how you feel, but it seems like it's always when you're away, right? Like, that stuff never happens. And so immediately starts thinking, God, what are you doing? Where are we in the middle of all of this? Much like maybe some of you when you heard the message, or maybe when it went out on email, or maybe when you just pulled up to a church to check it out for the first time today and you go, well, this is different, right? And so my goal today is I had a message prepared. We were going to talk about something about following Jesus. But like I said last week, if you were here, we talked about Hebrews chapter 12 and how it says that we're running a race. One of the things I said last week was when we ask things like, why is it so difficult? Or why is it different? Or why is it hard? The answer is it's a race, right? And so that was my first thought, as honestly, just as a follower of Jesus, was like, okay, it's a race. That's what we're doing. And so as a church, we are committed to sharing the good news of Jesus. And we're going to keep doing that. As a church, we have values that we lean into, and those aren't changing. We want to make Jesus make sense. We want to share life together. None of that's going away. As a church, we have a space that we meet in. On the good news, we get a new space. That'll be great. So we get to pick some paint colors, and we can fight about all that and all that stuff later. But in this moment, I just kind of want to maybe direct our hearts some. I think one of the most difficult things with transition, especially unexpected transition, is that we look for easy answers or just answers. We're like, God, tell me what's next. Tell me, I just need some certainty. Or how long? And some of those questions we have answers to. We can be certain that God is still God. Some of the questions we do not. How long? Well, optimistically, some people will tell you one thing and another people will tell you another. And here's what I would say, just as we're thinking through that. I'd be happy to answer questions about how long we think that would be. But I would just say, as a pastor, what I have learned through the hard way is that I think if we lean into the transition together and not, hey, how long is this going to be? When is the next step? We just want to lean it in together to what God is doing and really ask him, what are you doing? Maybe we get answers on that. Maybe we don't fully. But God, what do you have for us in this moment? Because I don't want to miss it. I really don't. Already, I have been encouraged. Already, just by what we're doing differently, I'm thinking differently about our church. Already, there's some people who I've seen connect today who I know both of you guys have been coming for 2 months and you've not connected. And now you're talking. Already, some of you are going, oh, we have kids space up here? This is great. So that's fun, too. Let me give you some thoughts from the God's Word about buildings. And then I just want to talk to 3 categories of people. So my first thought about buildings, and I wish, honestly, this was one text, but it's not, so I'm just going to tell you how I was thinking and where we go. The first thought I had about buildings is that the church existed before buildings. The church was before buildings. In fact, if you read the book of Acts, what you'll find is no one had a building. They had houses that they met in. They had a temple that they met in and out, but that was the Jewish temple, and for a time that overlapped and that changed. But for most of the time of what we look back at and go, man, that's the early church. Those are the young years when they were like first figuring out what God was doing. Man, when God was moving, when he was doing miracles, when people far from God were coming to know him. When we point to those things and go, that's awesome, that's amazing. They didn't have a screen. They didn't have a building. They didn't have a pew. All of those things came later. And I'm not saying those things are bad. They're just tools. They're just tools that are necessities over time. And so if we have to think about those things differently, and this forces us to do that, that's not a bad thing. I'm going to read for you. This is Acts chapter 17. Paul is talking to some people who are not followers of God, I mean they're not Jewish. These would be Greek and Roman people. He was in a village or town. He saw that they were very religious. He was looking at all the idols that they had set up, and they'd set up an idol to an unknown God. And he preaches to them, he talks to them, and he's reasoning with some of them. And this is what he says in that section of Scripture. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, everything we see right now, look around, feel, smell, all that God made in it, everything that God made, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he need anything, since he himself gives life to man and everything. Think about that. We don't do this for God in the sense that he needs it from us. We don't show up today because God is lacking in anything. We don't do a service because we are waiting on him or he's going. We do this because he first loved us. He gives us life. He gives us breath. He doesn't live down there, up there, over there. He doesn't live in that because he is larger than that. He said he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. He's determined their allotted periods and the bound areas of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from any of us. God is not far from you. Think about that. Yeah, he feels far at times. Sometimes we go, where are you? What are you doing? Because we're in a different space, or you're in a different seat, doesn't mean you're any further from God than you were last week, or that he's any farther from us. In fact, he tends to be ahead of us in a lot of ways. He says this, for in him we live and we move and we have our being. And so buildings are great, but that's not the point, right? The church has always existed apart from that. In fact, we are probably joining the majority of others across the globe who meet outdoors or under a shed or under a tree or in some space that's basically a rain shelter for them. And so we jump on board and look back and go, man, the church has always been the church before buildings. I had a second thought, and that was this, that the church is not a building. So the church existed before buildings, but the church is also not a building. It's not. When we say, I'm going to go to church, that's inaccurate, right? In fact, as a pastor, I get a little specific about that with my kids. I'll always say to them, hey, I'm going to the building. And they'll say, you mean the church building? I'm like, yeah, it's the building in which the church meets, right? Some of you grew up with the whole right? Here, you already know what I'm going to do, right? Here's the church. Here's the steeple, which we got rid of that a while ago, right? Open the doors and see all the people. We should just go, here's the church, right? So if you ever want to show somebody the church, there it is, right here. That's funky, but anyway. Paul reminds the Corinthian church. Paul was the first missionary of the early church. he reminds these people in Corinthians chapter 3, they're fighting about leaders and like, I go to such and such a church, and I go to such and such a church, and I was baptized by that pastor over there. Well, I was baptized by his pastor's pastor. And they were fighting about all that. So if you think that churches fight and that's new, they do fight, and it's not new. It's always been there. But Paul writes to them, and here's what he says. He goes, I planted, Apollos watered. Apollos was another guy. So he's like, hey guys, I started your church with the help of others. Some other guy came along and he watered it. But God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. Think about that first. We think it's, man, how's our signage? How's our sound? How's the lights? How's our coffee? That last one's a little important, but that's not where the growth comes from. The growth comes from God. He does it. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. And then he says this, for we are God's fellow workers. He's talking about he and Apollos. We're together, same team. Then he looks at them and goes, you're God's field. Y'all, that's what he says. Y'all are God's field. And then he says, God's building. So God doesn't live in a building. But if he did, it's you, if you know him, collectively. It's y'all. That's crazy. That the God who made heaven and earth doesn't need a house, and yet he chooses to live in you and me. That means that we show up to church when we show up like this. That means that church is not one person or one type of person or people who like the same things that you like and live in the same place that you live and love the same. It's different. And it's made that way, thank you, Grace, on purpose. And so, although the building is covered in yuck, God is here because you are here with one another. So the church existed before the building, and the church exists as not a building. And the last thought I had really from Scripture that I'd remind you this morning is that there is a church that God is building. There's one that he's constructing. I said this the other day at our communion service, and someone laughed. But they were talking about how the cross impacts our community. And how does that impact your community personally? And I said, well, as a pastor, that means I don't get to pick who comes to church here. Someone started laughing. And I'm like, that's the truth. Like, I don't get to say who shows up. In fact, many pastors wrestle with that because we have an idea in our head of when we get into like a calling, much like many of you do in work. It's going to be this way and it's going to go this way. And then you get in there and you're like, what are you doing, right? And God goes, here's who you'll pastor. And sometimes that's a joy. And sometimes that's difficult. But I don't pick that. Thank the Lord, right? I don't pick that. God builds his church as the good news goes to people who are far from him, transforms their hearts and brings them to know him. And we are not the only church in town, but collectively, it's the one that we are called to shepherd, pastor, and be together, and we do our best to do that. But all this comes from Matthew chapter 16. Jesus is talking to his disciples. They don't understand what's happening. They very rarely do. But Jesus asks them a question. He says this, who do people say that I am? Except he calls himself the Son of Man. That would have been a title that Jewish people were familiar with. He says, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Talking about himself. And they said, some say John the Baptist, and others say Elijah. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So he said to them, his disciples, who do you say that I am? It's an excellent question. One that I would encourage you to answer. Who do you say that I am? And a guy named Simon, who Jesus looked at him and called Peter, he renamed him. Simon Peter was a fisherman. He was kind of blue collar. We know that because he was a fisherman, he would have gone a certain education, stopped, and then gone back to his family's trade. Jesus called him one day when he hijacked his boat. Jesus stepped into his boat and said, row out. And Peter's like, all right. And then performs a miracle where Peter has the best day ever. As a fisherman, you're like, I don't know what best day ever you thought about at work. Like, maybe that's no customers. Or, like, maybe for you, it's a lot of customers. Like, if you're in sales, what's the best day ever? Man, we sell out of stuff. That would be amazing. For a fisherman, it's like, what if we caught all the fish in the world? What if our whole boat could fill up? Jesus steps into his boat, has him pull out offshore, preaches a sermon, turns back around, and says, hey, man, throw your net over. He brings in more fish than he's ever caught in his whole life. He pretty much accomplishes his best day ever. And then he looks at him and goes, why don't you follow me now? It's fascinating. Peter does that, and I say all this to say that Peter never had a doubt of what he was thinking because he always processed it verbally. He's always putting his foot in his mouth. And this one time, he speaks up. Of course he speaks up. Peter, what do you say? Simon Peter replied, you are the Messiah, or Savior, the Son of the living God. And Jesus looked at him, and he says something that sounds odd to us. He says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. That would have been his dad, Simon born of Jonah. He says, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. In other words, you didn't come up with this on your fisherman's education. But my Father who is in heaven. And he says, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. A couple things real quick. He's not saying Peter is the first apostle or bishop or whatever. He's looking, and here's what he's saying. He's going, Peter, I named you rock for a reason, right? You're hard-headed, but you don't move, right? And in the same way that you're been renamed solid, it's fitting, Peter, that you would be the one to say this. Because that same solidness and same thing that does not move, that confession that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, that's what I'm going to build my assembly. The word of the church is assembly, called out assembly on. And then he says this, the gates of hell are not going to stand against it. Now that is not a defensive statement. That's an offensive statement. He doesn't say the gates of heaven are not going to be able ever fall to the gates of hell. That would have been defensive. He goes offensive. He goes, here's the truth. Nothing is going to stop God from building his church. Now, that doesn't guarantee our church, just to be clear, right? We love to point at that. There's no guarantee I will always build your church or the one you have in your head. But he will always build his church. And so I do not know what is ahead, but I can confidently say that God is building his church even as we are not in a building, if that makes sense. If I could talk to transition for a minute and then talk to three groups of people out of what we just heard, just thinking about that. Here's how I would encourage you. Transitions often give us a chance to heal. They often get us out of our rhythms so that we might consider and wake up to the fact that maybe we've been running at a really fast pace. Or maybe we've been ignoring something thinking it'll go away. Or maybe God has been trying to say something to us. We've just been so busy that we haven't heard it. And maybe there's things in us that he wants to heal. Transitions also give us an opportunity to rehearse what we know is true. So what do I know is true? What can I say for sure? And there are a lot of things. And God is good. Jesus is King of the world. Some of the things that we talked about already with the building. They also give us hints about what God is doing. I don't think we know what God is doing. In fact, God says that. He's like, hey, who have I ever asked for advice from? Well, nobody, right? We know what he gives us to know. And so sometimes, though, I think in the midst of this, there's hints of like, God, what are you up to? God, what do you want to do in us? God, show me what you're doing. And I realize that corporate transition like this can sometimes spark personal transition in your life. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he begins to use some of this that way. I'm excited to find out. A lot of this takes time. We're going to have to figure out new ways to do things together. But we do not have it all together. We don't pretend that. But we're going to have to come up with some new ways to do things. There are going to be times where we will feel restless up ahead. Like, I thought we had access to a new space, and now they got to do another inspection, so now we got to wait further. So that'll all come. It will not always be sunny. Sometimes it'll rain. But I'm encouraged on where we're going together. I would say, if I could talk to three groups for a moment. Some of you are here. There's a group of you here who knew and knows what this church was 10 to 15 years ago, before you wound up here in this building. Some of you knew the old building that existed about half a mile, maybe a mile away. Some of you remember when this was just a temporary space for you. Some of you remember what it was like not to know where your church would be in that moment. And so what we're doing is not new for you. That feeling of going, well, what do we do next? Setting things up, tearing things down, meeting outside. You remember the last time we did that as a church. And I would remind you, God is faithful and had been faithful. And you didn't know it at the time that this would have been a permanent situation, but it was. And little by little, he began to show his faithfulness. And so the fact that God doesn't live in a building and that we're the church and that he's building something, you know that already, but I just point you back to that again. Some of you don't know anything about that. In fact, some of you endure people telling you stories about the good old days as if you were there. So thank you for that. Some of you hear names all the time. Oh, I remember Pastor. You're like, I don't know who that was, right? Thank you for that as well. But all you know is what you've come to. You came to this space because you saw a sign, you met a person, you got online, a pandemic happened. We grew 65% in the pandemic. That's crazy. Like, we remember what it was like when we didn't meet for a little bit in a normal space, and then we got back into the rhythm and we had to change all this. Like, you know this already. You've got a memory, muscle memory for that. But hopefully you've seen little by little God in his faithfulness to continue to grow and build his church. And you yourself are proof of that. There was a time when there was a group of about 20 to 35 people who thought this was done. And little by little we've seen families and kids and people from all walks of life. I was just talking budget stuff last week after service. We had a steering team meeting. Budget time's coming up. We were presented with stuff and just plans, and we were counting God's faithfulness. And I walked away encouraged, excited, and so proud of you for the way that you serve and the way that you love one another and how you care for one another. So don't stop doing that in the midst of this. You are still the church. God's still at work in you. And then the third group and the last group that I talked to, some of you have just started coming. Like 2 months since January, maybe since Christmas, maybe 2 weeks, maybe an hour. I don't know, right? And here's honestly, as a pastor, when I think about who I'm concerned for, it's you guys. Because as a pastor, I go this way. I go, oh man, they were just starting to get connected. I hope that this bump and disturbance doesn't stop any growth or renewal or personal enrichment that they're finding. And I know that there's a temptation in there to disengage and maybe wait and hang out for a couple weeks and see where we all land. And if you choose to do that, no harm, no foul. But as a pastor, here's what I would say. Would you consider leaning in together with us in this? Because I do believe that the church that we are on the other side of this will be different from the church that we are now. And I think, if I know God, that that's going to be better together. It will be more mature and honestly ready to do what he's called us to do. And so all three of those groups exist here in this moment. And I just kind of want to show you that real quick. Hugh, I asked you to be an easel. Can you grab that painting over there? This is the old church building. Some of you are like, I've never seen that painting before. I know, I took it and put it in my office so that you wouldn't. Some of you are like, that's my church because you built that building or you constructed that building. I grew up here. And then some of you, you're like, I don't care. But anyway, I grew up here. I threw a Frisbee once on top of that roof right there, and I climbed up it. And my wife and I were on a break from dating at the time, and I tossed a Frisbee from there, and I hit her in the back of the head right there. And it was the best shot I've ever made with a Frisbee. And she still married me. I was inside there. There was a baptismal. I was baptized in there. We used to play sardines and hide and go seek and football after Thanksgiving on the field out front. What else could I tell you? There were scary parts of this church when you were there by yourself and the lights were out. One time, my friends and I thought we would be in a band, and we got the key to the church and plugged in a guitar to a really small sound system and started a fire in the nursery because the speaker line caught fire. And we were found out by my pastor at the time when he smelled smoke and came to find it, which then we had to admit that we were playing certain type of music in the church building, and also we started a fire. That was us, which was really rad as a rock band. Like, we literally lit something on fire with music. There are people here who could tell you hundreds of stories about this, and for them, this was church. And you know what? There are people's names in here who I'd love to talk to you about. People who have gone to see Jesus, whose names are written on the inside of books that I just have in my library. There are people who built things that we still see around here and pictures and all of that. I would love to tell you those stories. People that you've never met, because at some point in time, they started a foundation that God watered and other people planted, God watered. And they wouldn't want the credit, right? Through providence and whatnot, this building no longer exists. U-Point exists. So if you live in those apartments on Grace Road or Lane or whatever up there, that Grace Lane Road is because this church is there, and U-Point is where this was. That's then and there, who cares? This brick is that right there. And I have it on the shelf in my office. And the reason I have it on my shelf is because I had someone go steal it when they were demoing the building, because it meant something to me. And I think there's a context, and this is kind of where I'm ending up. So don't worry, I'm going to stop talking. But there's a context in which we can look at all that and we can go, or hopefully you understand what I mean, even if you don't have this experience here. There are times when God moves in churches and buildings, and you're like, man, that's where we attach our memory, and that's the church that I remember. And honestly, some of you are checking us out because you're looking for the church that you grew up in. You think you can go back to that or whatnot. Look, all that stuff burns. All that stuff gets demoed and knocked down, right? And I think there's a temptation for us to look at it and go, man, all that good stuff and all that effort and all that energy and all that money and all the things that we put our time into, and this is what's left, right? All that knocked down, you got a brick left. And here's what I would say. That's not true. Like, this is not the legacy of that. This is. Like, look around. Like, y'all are what's left and what God is building and what he's doing from that. One day, someday, they're going to demo that building. Sooner the better. I don't know. We definitely know they're going to demo that building, right, at some point. They'll demo that building. Someone will sort through our photos and go, who's that? And if you're left and you're old, you'll tell them for the 40th time who that is and why that is. But I guarantee you that when we see Jesus, we're not going to be talking about this stuff. We're going to be talking about what he did in you and in me through his good news, through the cross. And when Jesus looked at Peter and goes, hey, Peter, your name's Peter, and it's good that fitting that you're saying that, he wasn't talking about these kind of rocks. He's talking about himself. And he's the only foundation. And we or the building right now, who one day will be forgotten, but one day he will be known because of your efforts. That's where I want to go together. So I'm going to ask you to pray. Thank you, Hugh. You appreciate it. That's where I want to go together for a moment. I'm going to ask you where you are to kind of huddle up with somebody next to you. Introduce yourself. And then I would say if one or two of you would just be willing to pray. Here's what I would ask you to pray. One, that the good news of Jesus would continue to go forth from us. In that the people who he's already working in, he has people who need to know Jesus because of what he's doing in here. So pray for that. The gospel, good news of Jesus. Second thing, that we as a church would use wisdom and discernment to lean in together to what he's doing together. So pray for that. Good news of Jesus, leaning in together. And if you want a bonus one, pray for unity, please. We want you to continue to love one another, and we don't know what we're doing. We've never been in this section before. We think God's up to something. We're going to lead as best as we know how. But do that for a little bit. Michael's going to come up. When he starts singing, kind of wrap up your prayers. We'll end with music, and then I'll come back up, give you some instructions on how you can know what happens next from here. I appreciate your willingness to do that. Circle up if you don't mind.